February 20th, 1943, north of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The battlefield was cloaked in wind-blown sand and the distant echo of artillery. But what caught the attention of German Panzer commanders that morning wasn't the roar of guns. It was the silence between them. 5 American Sherman tanks, separated by broken terrain and without any line of sight, began converging on their position with uncanny precision. No flags waved, no runners darted between vehicles. There were no visible flares or signals, yet these tanks moved as one, covering angles, adjusting formations, responding to threats not with hesitation, but with the kind of split-second coordination that suggested they could see through the hills and smoke. To the Germans, it defied logic. To their doctrine, it was impossible. German Panzer IV commanders relied on outdated amplitude modulation AM radios that fizzled and crackled under battlefield noise. Only a few tanks in a platoon even had the ability to transmit. The rest were glorified listeners, silent, blind, unable to warn, to coordinate, or to react fast enough. But the Americans had something else. Inside each Sherman was a radio system that none of the German troops had ever seen. Frequency modulation, FM radios, crystal-controlled, high-powered, built with precision, and capable of cutting through the din of war like a blade through canvas. The tanks weren't just armored weapons. They were nodes in a battlefield network the Germans didn't know existed. This moment, though just one of thousands during World War II, marked the quiet turning point in armored warfare. Not because of who had the bigger gun or thicker armor, but because of who could talk, clearly, constantly, and with certainty. At the heart of the transformation was the SCR-508 radio, deployed by the United States Army starting in 1941. Developed by engineers at Galvin Manufacturing, later known as Motorola, it was a technological leap forward. American tanks didn't just roll off the line with engines and weapons. They came wired for war. The BC-604 transmitter inside the SCR-508 pushed 25 watts of power, more than double that of the German FUG-5, and could maintain communication over 7 miles while moving. Twin BC-603 receivers allowed tank commanders to listen to both company and platoon channels at once. It was a symphony of coordination in the middle of chaos. For German crews, accustomed to static and silence, it was disorienting. Throughout the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the Germans would win tactical ground, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. They had believed their tanks were superior, and in many cases on paper they were. But the Americans moved as a unit in ways the Germans couldn't replicate. That coordination came from more than training. It came from hardware embedded in every turret. And that hardware had a name, SCR-508. The Germans couldn't understand how scattered American tank crews, unfamiliar with the terrain and facing a veteran Panzer force, could still coordinate, flank, and react faster. Their radios couldn't match the clarity. Their units couldn't adapt as quickly. They couldn't even ask for artillery without losing precious time. The war had become a contest not only of bullets and steel, but of information, and who could share it the fastest. February 21st, 1943. The desert sun climbed high, baking the rocky gullies and ridges that stretched north of Kasserine Pass. Across the rolling dunes and jagged peaks, the roar of tanks and the whistle of shell fragments filled the air. In the midst of it all, the U.S. 1st Armored Division prepared for action, their tanks marked with stars and olive-drab steel, crews tense and ready. For German tankers from the Panzer Lehr Division and the 10th Panzer Division, the battlefield looked familiar, but something about the Americans' movements felt uncanny. Late the night before, a U.S. platoon had set up vantage positions along a ridgeline. At dawn, they turned east, their 5 Sherman tanks peeling off into the terrain, navigating gullies and folds that made mutual visual contact impossible. German spotters placed Panzers in position, expecting the usual formations, the usual delays as tanks surveyed, signaled, maneuvered. Instead, the Shermans appeared one after the other, each tank silent but purposeful, fan-out executed without hesitation. They enveloped the German flank with a precision that made Oberleutnant Erich Voss pinch his binoculars and ask the question he dared not give voice. How do they coordinate this? In German doctrine, the engine roar, the sand drift, the dust screen, all these added interference. Their radios, mostly receivers or limited power transmitters, could barely communicate when the treads were rolling. A tank leader depended on visual cues, flags, flares, loudspeakers, or dispatch runners. Orders went to command tanks. Once those tanks were knocked out, the rest often drifted. But the Americans had something different. From the Gulf of Tunis to the ranges of Michigan, the Army's engineers had quietly wired medium tanks with a new kind of radio. The SCR-508 family, FM, crystal-controlled, robust, standardized 22nd July 1941, was installed in almost every Sherman by mid-1943. Wikipedia +2 theshermantank.com+2. The specifications alone told the story. A BC-604 transmitter in each set pushed 25 watts of transmission power, more than double the standard German FUG 510-watt sets. The 20.0 to 27.9 MHz frequency range, 10 preset channels, dual receivers, BC-603, allowed a tank commander to monitor both the platoon net and company net at once. The ShermanTank.com+1. The radios could be powered on 12 or 24 volts via dynamotors. Again, versatility the German sets lacked. And because they used frequency modulation, FM, rather than amplitude modulation, AM, the communications cut through engine noise, tracks grinding, desert dust storms, something German radios simply could not. TheShermanTank.com. In the early morning glare, the Shermans advanced. A German tank observed the lead vehicle come around a ridge before the other 4 tanks were visible. Yet the 5 moved as one. The lead tank stopped, radioed an artillery observer. Target grid 75 Bravo, fire mission ready. The second tank shifted to cover the right flank. The third moved left. The fourth and fifth backed up reserves. Almost instantly, mortars and artillery fell on the German positions. The tanks then pressed forward. To German ears, it seemed as if the Shermans shared one mind. Behind the scenes, U.S. Signal Corps technicians tracked waveforms, monitored range tests, and field-tested the FM sets in operational conditions. At the Galvin Manufacturing Company, later Motorola, engineers like Daniel E. Noble and Henryk Magnuski solved problems. How to maintain crystal stability under shock, how to integrate intercom systems, BC-606, so every crew member could hear and speak within the tank, and how to mount antennas and sheet metal shielding so the radio didn't pick up track motor interference. Radio Museum. Every Sherman rolling off factories at Detroit, Lima, and lines across the Midwest became a communications hub. In contrast, German Panzer units remained tied to lagging technology. Many tanks carried only receivers, Fuji-2, or used receivers that worked but couldn't transmit. The FUG-5 transmitters were limited to still positions. Once the tanks moved, static and interference knocked them out. Intelligence captured by German Signal Regiment reports confirmed the widening gap. American tank units maintained communication at ranges where our sets ran only noise. These words carried quietly through Wehrmacht headquarters, but produced little change. The Germans believed the edge still lay in armored quality and superior guns. TheShermanTank.com. By early March, the Americans moved into Tunisia's plains. The First Armored's tactics changed. Rather than concentrate tanks and firepower in massive brash assaults, Commanders used dispersed formations, interlinked by radio, scouting ahead, covering flanks, coordinating with infantry and artillery. The network worked so well that crews in separate compartments could call in fire, adjust positioning, feed information to other tanks, and respond dynamically to threat reports. Visibility irrelevant, only signals mattered. German command was slow to adapt. On board a Panther AUSFG with its Fuji 5, Voss tried to synchronize with adjacent tanks. He barked over the radio, "Fire free!" But no acknowledgement came. The radio hissed. His platoon remained mostly silent. Meanwhile, he heard static, clangs, sparks, voices overlain by hiss. He sat up, confused. On his left, the enemy tanks moved in. By the time the German flak met the threat, it was too late. The enemy strike came. Later, captured German reports described the feeling. "We sat on a ridge, saw the shapes form. Then they opened fire. It was like we were isolated." That isolation, Voss thought later in his memoirs, cost more than numbers or terrain. The implications weren't just tactical, they were strategic. The final defeat of the Axis in North Africa came in May 1943, but the real lesson that day in February echoed into Italy and across Europe. The one who talks wins. Technology had become a force multiplier. The Sherman tank, though arm's length inferior in turret armor or gun caliber in many engagements, wielded a superior capability: universal, integrated communication. In Italy that fall, the rugged terrain around Monte Cassino, the narrow passes of the Apennines, the limited sight lines all favored defenders. But the Shermans moved with rhythm. Liaison radios, field telephones, vehicles all interconnected. German tank crews found themselves outflanked in terrain that should have neutralized American mobility. But the nets worked, all because of radio. And when the Allied invasion of Normandy dawned, amid hedgerows and mud, the Shermans didn't stand alone. They spoke. Tanks called infantry, attack aircraft loitered under net control. Artillery responded instantly. The Germans counted hedges and anti-tank guns. The Americans counted messages, because the network never rested. For the tankers themselves, a quiet confidence grew. Sergeant David Morales of the 2nd Armored Division later recalled, "In that hole near Kasserine, I heard the crackle of the net. I knew there were guys behind me, not just tanks beside me. That voice saved us. Radios may be invisible, but for those men, they were lifelines." So as the dust cleared that day in Tunisia, the Germans recorded the damage. More tanks lost, more ground conceded, more fuel lines broken. But under the map marks and tally boards, a deeper defeat. The belief that superior equipment alone could win war. That assumption died when the Shermans rolled in with voice and clarity, not just steel and fire. By spring 1943, the war in North Africa had reached a pivot. The desert campaigns were brutal, grinding affairs of tanks, guns, sand, and sun. One afternoon, the sun beat down over the Chat El Jarid salt flats, shimmering like ghost heat above the cracked earth. American Sherman crews braced themselves for what they knew would be a clash. They had training, they had radios, but they did not yet know just how far ahead they had become. German Panzer formations rolled forward, confident in their doctrine. Their tanks were newer models, their crews experienced, their tactics honed in France, in Russia, in Libya. They moved in massed assaults, reliance on visual signals, dispatch riders, hand signals, and voice commands carried by shouted orders. The German doctrine of armored warfare demanded sight, direct contact, speed, and when those failed, fallback was chaos. On the morning of March 9th, a mixed force of U.S. Sherman medium tanks and Allied infantry advanced toward the ridges overlooking the pass. The terrain was broken. Gullies, hills, dry riverbeds cut into the ground like trenches. Visibility at distances over 300 meters was unreliable. Dust whipped along the ridgelines, tanks loomed from false shadows, infantry moved under cover and communicated by signal flags and whistles. But the Americans had something the Germans did not. One Sherman tank commander, Lieutenant Robert Bob Walker of the 4th Armored Division, recalled later how he wired his crew. Channel 2 for company net, Channel 3 for support. I listened to artillery observer call fire mission, adjusted. Then I told Charlie Tank, shift left flank. We were separated by 800 meters of flat dunes. I never saw him, but I heard his voice. While the German tanks waited for the signal, the American network surged. Radios clicked on. Headsets hissed to life. One tank spotted infantry on the ridge and radioed, "Infantry at grid 46M, left flank, 3 o'clock. Instantly, another tank swung left. A third tank ceased forward advance and thinly skirted the gully to cover the right. From across the formation, a tank commander called in artillery. "Battery identify, grid 48J, aim 330 degrees, fire for effect." The shells dropped, created gaps in the ridge, and the American tanks surged. German tanks, surprised, tried to respond. Oberleutnant Erich Voss's Panther crew received garbled radio commands, the signal fading, static filling with each turning track, each motor roar. The German subsidiary units lost cohesion. Some tanks held fire, others passed the buck. The coordinated sweep collapsed under pressure. What the German intelligence could not fathom then, and would struggle to grasp ever after, was that American tanks were not just equipment. They were nodes in an integrated system. Every crew, every tank, linked by constant communication, able to adapt instantly. The radio network allowed for mission changes mid-advance. Leaders could issue new objectives, support units could cover mistakes, and flank tanks could reroute without waiting for signal flags or visual confirmation. While the Germans held their doctrine close, mass, speed, decisive action, the Americans rewrote the rules. In Italy in 1944, the Apennines' narrow ridges and tangled olive groves should have favored defenders. German anti-tank guns waited in valleys. Sight lines were short. Armor advantage should have counted for something. Instead, the Shermans advanced in a series of coordinated pincer movements. Tanks on one ridge calling the tanks on another ridge to advance. Infantry watching the nets and feeding back threat reports. Artillery dropping down with precision. One afternoon, a Sherman crew climbed a steep ridge above the river Rapido. They called back to a sister tank below. "Charlie 2, shift to 305, left flank secure," said the voice over the net. The sister tank repositioned instantly. In the ravine below, a German Jagdpanzer waited in ambush. It fired. The round struck the lead Sherman's left track. The crew radioed, "Track disabled, flank shift right." The sister tank covered while the platoon medics and recovery vehicle arrived. All of this happened in minutes. The German ambush, executed in hours, failed. At Normandy, the moment grew grander still. On June 6, 1944, Shermans rolled off landing craft. They had radios. They even had communications with naval fire support and some with infantry units, though not fully. German tanks and anti-tank teams relied on lines of sight, on infantry spotting, on flag semaphores when voice failed them. On the bocage, where visibility shrank and gun duels followed narrow lanes, American units held a hidden edge: the net. One Sherman spotted a Panzer IV moving along a lane. The radio operator called the company net. Opposing tank, grid 12C, moving south. Alpha 1, intercept 2 Shermans peeled away and struck the flank. Meanwhile, another tank called artillery. Battery 4, grid 14-D, mark target, fire mission now. The shells destroyed the gun pit. The German defenders were disoriented. German reports after Normandy repeatedly referenced well-coordinated American armor and tanks that seemed to know where each other were. They could not detect the root cause, the widespread deployment of FM radios. They attributed it to discipline or training, but couldn't find the technological secret. Back in the factories in Detroit, Lima, and across the U.S., production numbers told the story. More than 50,000 tanks built, everyone fitted with SCR-508 or its variants. The integration of BC-604 transmitters, BC-603 dual receivers, and BC-606 intercom systems meant that shell shocks, engine noise, and track vibration were not obstacles. They were background. Engineers at Galvin Manufacturing solved those problems. One memo from 1942 described it. We must maintain channel stability and crew audibility while the tank is moving. The components weighed 181 pounds, yet they fit inside every M4 Sherman. German technical intelligence after the war confirmed the gap. German tanks were about 5 years behind American radio production. The German communication system's inability to transmit, poor range, lack of intercoms for tank crews, and reliance on visual commands were decisive disadvantages. The German tank crews fought with one ear to the net of noise instead of networked precision. For the Sherman tank crew, the radio was more than a luxury. It was solidarity. One tank gunner later said, "I didn't feel like I was alone anymore." Another driver, 10th Armored Infantry Support, said, "When I heard the voice call, 'Reload ready,' I knew we were synchronized." They fought as team, as network, as force multiplying each other. In an Italian forest near Lake Garda, an American tanker's laughter echoed. They had executed a movement known to German commanders only as impossible. One Sherman separated by hills and trees from his company still responded to a flank call. A Panther hidden above could not press the advantage because German communication failed. The gap between doctrine and reality widened. What the enemy could not measure, they could not defeat. The German armored commanders, proud, experienced, elite, they realized they were being outmatched not in steel, but in signal. They were fighting blind, while their enemy moved with connection. That knowledge landed heavy. And for every crew who climbed into Shermans with the local star painted on the front, for every mechanic who wired the sets, for every operator who tuned the frequencies before battle, they created something not seen on battlefield maps. They created a network. They created a weapons system built on connection instead of solitary strength. It changed the way war was fought and won. The summer of 1944 marked a new phase in the war. The beaches of Normandy had been secured, the hedgerows loomed, and the terrain that should have favored the defender was stretching the skills of every man and machine. For the Germans, there remained belief in their tanks, their training, and the discipline of their crews. But the Americans had already moved beyond those traits. They were operating as a network. On the morning of July 25th, during Operation Cobra, the 2nd Armored Division surged out of the hedgerow country. Organization, speed, flexibility, qualities the German doctrine prized, were all there. But what the Germans failed to measure was how each of those qualities was now built on constant, seamless communication. When the Shermans rolled, every tank carried a radio set. The engineers of Galvin Manufacturing Company, later known as Motorola, had solved more than power settings and frequency ranges. They had designed rugged intercoms for crews, dual-channel receivers, and antenna systems that worked in motion, across rough terrain and under fire. The entire production line had been rewired. Every M4 Sherman tank from Detroit to Lima came fitted with the SCR-508 series. This wasn't a luxury option, it was standard issue. And when those tanks entered combat, the result was felt by German crews who were still trying to shout orders over engine roar and dust. In the bocage of Normandy, visibility often dropped under 10 meters. Tanks were hemmed in by hedgerows, small fields, ditches, and concealed anti-tank guns. A formation of Panzers could wait for hours, trying to locate a target before cooperating. For the Americans, the same terrain became manageable, not because their guns were bigger, not because their armor thicker, but because the network didn't depend on sight. One Sherman would radio its position. Alpha 1, grid 22C, sighting Panther, 250 degrees. Another would respond, copy, shifting right. Delta 6, moving into position. Within minutes, an interlocking attack unfolded. No visual signals, no flares, no couriers, only voices and movement. German intelligence reports from the time reflect a strange frustration. Field reports repeatedly mention U.S. tank units with exceptional coordination and apparently prearranged responses despite terrain that should have muffled communication. They did not, however, capture the secret. They attributed the edge to training rather than technology. They missed the fact that every American tank carried a communications suite that allowed the tank to think as part of a single organism. Meanwhile, German tanks still operated with AM sets that were limited in range, prone to static when moving, and often one-way only. Many tanks lacked transmitters altogether. Because the Germans built their doctrine on the assumption of visual or voice signaling, their organization began to crack when the Americans moved beyond those signals. Take the drive across the Falaise Pocket. American tank battalions, spread across 5 miles of fronts, motored forward, coordinated by voice over the nets, while German command struggled with units cut off due to line-of-sight failures or broken wires. One Sherman would call forward, "Charlie Squadron ahead, flank secured. Broken vehicles at 65 grid. Recommend direct artillery fire." A liaison officer heard the reply over an open net. German anti-tank ambushes, planned for hours with precision, found themselves countered before they fired a shot. The network denied the German doctrine its essential: surprise, concentration, decisive impact. In northern France, German tanks began to refer to the ghost convoys of Shermans, units that appeared in places they should not have, struck with coordination, and vanished. On 10th June 1944, an American tank platoon near Carentan executed a flank move that German intelligence later noted. 5 tanks operating without heavy support, yet advancing in perfect alignment as if directed by hand signals unseen, the Germans believed they were facing better gunners or more aggressive crews. They did not believe they were facing a network. Back in Germany, criticisms of armored doctrine began to surface. Senior officers like Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, recognized that the Americans were doing something different, but he could not reverse the industrial and organizational lag fast enough. German factories were producing some of the finest tanks, Panthers, Tigers, but the communications fitments were not keeping pace. The attention remained on gun caliber, armor thickness, and tactical expertise, while the invisible advantage of connectedness slipped through their fingers. In the Italian campaign, the network advantage became more glaring. Mountain ridges, narrow valleys, and olive groves should have leveled the playing field. Visual contact was difficult. Radio jamming and terrain interference should have disadvantaged armies reliant on wireless. But the American FM sets cut through the chaos. One platoon of Shermans and accompanying infantry reached a ridge overlooking the Rapido Valley and discovered a Panther II in ambush. The lead tank radioed the flank tanks. Ambush left rear. Shift 270, fire mission ready. While German crews scrambled, the Americans' coordinated suppression fire from artillery moved up the flank and struck before the ambush could activate. What the German crews felt was isolation. One Panther commander noted, "We did not know where our neighbors were. We heard nothing. Their tanks came out of the woods and struck our flank. For them, every fight became a fragmented engagement." For the Americans, each tank was part of a living network. Furthermore, the production numbers tell the story. By mid-1944, the U.S. had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks, and every one of them came with a fully integrated radio set. The Germans produced far fewer transceivers. Many tanks were never fitted with full radios, or were equipped with outdated AM systems, unable to transmit or coordinate effectively. Some German units still depended on runners, flags, or pre-planned timing, and in fast-moving battle, those methods failed. These figures weren't abstract. They translated into battlefield tempo. Consider the final push into Germany in March 1945. The rapid seizure of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was as much about communications as it was about courage. A Sherman tank commander radioed his battalion HQ within minutes of securing the bridge. Bridge intact, 3,765 meters. Enemy forces delaying at East Bank. Request support now. The response came fast. Another Sherman rolled up minutes later, provided cover, and coordinated artillery and infantry units in real time. German counterattacks struggled to marshal because their communication nets were fragmented and delayed. The radio network won battles of reaction and initiative. For the Americans, the network needed training, yes, but crucially, it needed hardware. Crews practiced radio discipline. They drilled procedures. They matured as a networked force. But the difference in hardware provided the foundation. The twin-channel receivers, FM modulation, stable crystals, intercom systems, all meant that each crew could listen, speak, adapt, coordinate. They were united without needing ocular confirmation. And for the German crews, the realization came too late. The war was still of tanks and guns, of shells and tracks, but the underlying advantage had shifted. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a node in a system, a connected war machine. German commanders had assumed their tanks would defeat enemy machines. Instead, they discovered they were battling a network. To the tankers, you sat in your turrets, linked to your crew, and heard the voice of your platoon mate 5 clicks away. You knew you were not alone. To the families waiting back home, your loved one was not just fighting, they were part of a system, a voice, a force that moved as one. And to history, the lesson remains that in war, connection often matters more than caliber. As summer deepened into autumn 1944, the war across Europe was shifting gears. The once impenetrable German lines began to crack. Fields of battle that once favored the defender now unfolded into corridors of motion. And at the heart of this shift lay not simply tanks or rifles, but a network born in steel, wires, antennas, and voices. By this time, the U.S. armored formations had internalized what the radio had become. More than a tool, it was the system. No longer was each tank a siloed fighting machine. Each was connected. Each crew heard the same war unfolding at the same time. On August 15th, the 4th Armored Division turned east from the Argenton-Falaise Gap. Tanks of the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions rolled across the Oise Canal. Sherman streamed across the French countryside, radios buzzing, channels alive with information. They maneuvered through wrecked German rear areas, surprised columns emerging from the shattered front, while their transmissions never ceased. A lead tank reported flanks secure. A trailing tank confirmed artillery on target. Another tank adjusted its route based on infantry contact. What had once taken hours in coordination now took minutes. The Germans, watching from their command posts, found themselves chasing ghosts. They noted in their intelligence logs that American tanks communicated at distances where they lost reception, and the clarity of the voice was abnormal. They still believed the edge was in gun caliber or thick armor, yet the Americans were proving otherwise. German doctrine, built around mass, firepower, and direct visual contact, faltered in the face of an enemy that communicated without silence. In the rugged terrain of Italy that autumn, the radios again showed their worth. Around Monte Cassino and later toward the Gothic Line, the American Sherman guns moved through terrain so broken that visual signals were almost useless. But radio nets didn't rely on sight. A Sherman on a ridge radioed a sister tank across a dell. Alpha 3, Grid 45B, enemy vehicles retreating west. Shift 260 and provide flank cover. Instantly, the sister tank shifted. The Sicilian dust storms, olive tree canopies, and crumbling villages no longer isolated units. The network connected. German defenders scrambled as flank tanks emerged from places they believed safe. Guns opened from unexpected directions. Coordination happened without visible planning. One German Panther platoon, waiting for the American advance, was stunned when Shermans appeared from a side trail the Panther crews didn't know had been used. The German report read simply, "They appeared before we could warn each other." That ignorance, the inability to warn, to receive, to transmit, was the latest chapter in a larger story: communications dominance. The chain of production back in the United States underpinned this transformation. By mid-1944, the U.S. was manufacturing thousands of the SCR-508 family radios for the Sherman SCR-528 and SCR-538 variants as needed. Each tank rolled off the assembly line fitted for full duplex coordination, BC604 transmitter, twin BC603 receivers, intercom systems seamlessly integrated. As one historian noted, the Sherman tank had some of the most advanced radios in the world at the time. TheShermanTank.com +2 TheShermanTank.com +2. The broadcasts inside each turret turned the tank crews into nodes of situational awareness. Every crew heard what others knew. Every commander could decide based on what his comrades faced, and every move fed back into the network. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of Germany, the German forces carried fear but lacked voice. Their radios remained limited in range, plagued by interference, or absent altogether in many tanks. Their doctrine still emphasized sight, but the war had shifted to hearing. One German intelligence document remarked, "The American tank units exhibited coherence beyond our countermeasures." Yet they misinterpreted the cause, attributing it to discipline instead of design. The fact remained, the Germans never fully recognized the strategic value of the invisible waves inside American tanks. TheShermanTank.com +1. Elsewhere, the Americans experimented and extended their network. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Sherman crews and infantry units used radios, field telephones, and auxiliary wiring to coordinate across bridges and rivers. Even when infantry radios weren't compatible with tank nets, adaptation happened. Canteen trucks, field telephone systems wired to tank bustle boxes, and improvised links bridged the gap. The result, tanks and infantry moved in harmony, a leap ahead of earlier campaigns. The clarity of communication reduced confusion, allowed rapid reaction, and converted what might have been a disjointed assault into a unified movement. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted, American tank crews no longer felt isolated. They fought in a web of intelligence, artillery, air support, and infantry, all connected. Sherman screamed across the Ardennes, responding to calls, shifting routes, threatening German columns before those columns knew they were exposed. The German tanks, sleek and powerful, advanced in silence. They carried firepower, but lacked the voice to lead one another. Their formations broke. Their doctrine echoed empty. Meanwhile, the nets inside American tanks carried on. One after-action report from a Sherman crew captured those moments. "We heard the voice of the platoon leader, shift flank. Then I heard Charlie tank, enemy bogged. Then one of our artillery observers, Fire mission underway. I didn't see the enemy before I heard them getting plastered. That voice, clear, calm, unbroken, was the edge. For the veterans who sat inside those tanks, decades later, the memory wasn't just the roar of the tracks or the flash of the gun. It was the hum of the radio, the click of the channels, the feeling that they were not alone. Tank Commander First Lieutenant Harold Davis recalled, "In the turret, I heard someone behind me say, 'Enemy light tank 340. I turned turret right. His shot ruined the Panther on my right. I never saw him. I only listened. The radio carried him. It saved him.'" As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and marched into Germany in early 1945, the utility of the network peaked. When a Sherman of the 9th Armored Division crossed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, the message reached headquarters minutes later. Bridge intact. Enemy reaction incoming. Request immediate armor reinforcement. Within the hour, multiple armored divisions rolled forward. Meanwhile, German counterattacks, delayed by fragmentary communication, arrived in disarray. The difference was not that the Shermans had better guns, it was that they were connected. In the end, the tactics that defined blitzkrieg, the tanks, the armor, the speed, all of it had to function inside the mind of the formation. The Americans had turned the tank into a brain. The Shermans weren't just individually brave, they fought together. They listened, responded, adapted. They were not isolated weapons, they were parts of a larger force. The network meant connection, and connection bred victory. So, as we reflect on February's desert dust in Tunisia, and the thunder of Normandy's hedgerows, and the mud of the Rhineland, remember this: the decisive advantage came not solely from firepower, but from voice. It came from the capacity to coordinate across space and time. It came from the tank that could hear and could speak. For the crew members, you operated inside a machine that listened. For the families, you supported men who fought not only with weapons, but with voices. And for history, the lesson remains clear. When machines listen, men lead. When machines speak, wars are won. The engines have long fallen silent. The tracks are worn and stored away. Many of the men who climbed into the tanks, who trusted not only the turret and the gun, but the unseen network humming in their helmets, have passed on. But their story remains. To the veterans who fought in the tanks, to the families who waited at home, to the next generations who carry their memory, this is for you. In the quiet after the storm, the significance of those radios became clear. Not the clank of steel or the flash of gunfire, but the voice in the headset. The tank commander speaking softly over the net. Alpha 2, flank secure. Advance grid 528. The driver responding, copy, moving. The gunner. Target identified. Ready. The infantry ripping through the trees. Enemy approximately 300 meters. Shift 280 left, and the artillery observer. Fire mission on hold until clearance. All voices linked, all units synchronized. A silent network of brothers. For the veteran who still hears the hiss of the FM set when the radio comes on, you knew what it meant. Not just, we're moving, but we're together. In battle, you may have been separated by ridges, forests, shell fire, even miles. But through that radio, you were beside each other. You didn't wait for a signal flag or a runner. You heard a voice you trusted, a voice that meant you were not alone. That gave courage, that saved lives. For the family member whose father, grandfather, or uncle never spoke of the radio, only of the day the tank rolled out and the world changed, know this: in his silence lived the weight of what he heard, both over the wireless and what he never said. You carried the home front so he could carry the front line. You held the letters, the emptiness, the waiting. You upheld hope, and you deserve honor. Because the radios did more than transmit words. They transformed thinking. They turned each tank into a node, each crew into a team, each division into a system. The war changed not when the tanks fired, but when they listened. German commanders, to their surprise and frustration, learned this lesson the hard way. They assumed their superior tanks, elite crews, and tactics would carry the day. They had not counted on one tank being able to speak to another. They did not know they were fated to fight an enemy who'd built a network of steel and signal. By the time that understanding dawned, the force had moved, the lines had broken, the war's tempo had changed. And so we finish not on a battlefield, but in memory, because memory endures. The clatter of tracks and roar of guns may fade, but the voice remains. The wireless voice that bound us together, that spoke of purpose and duty, that reminded us one voice can save many. To the veterans, when you hear that voice in your head, when the tank rumbles somewhere in your dream, know this: we remember. We stand with you. The radio you trusted, the tank you commanded, the men you moved with, they are honored. To the families, your courage was unseen but no less real. The waiting, the letters, the hope, the sacrifice. You empowered the network that fought. Your story walks beside theirs. And to our viewers today, who didn't know these radios changed war, reflect. Because the network you rely on now, phones, data, coordination, traces back to those SCR 508 sets, the BC 604 transmitters, the twin receivers and intercoms trained inside every Sherman. The lesson: connection matters. In war, in life, in memory. If you found value in this story, of the men, the machines, and the invisible waves that tied them together, please like this video, comment your own family connection, or story of those who listened and spoke in war, and subscribe to our channel to honor those who served. Share this with a veteran, a family member, someone who will understand the weight of a radio voice under fire. Let us carry their message forward. We will not forget that the side that could talk won the fight. That every Sherman tank was more than steel. It was a voice. That in the end, victory came not solely from armor or caliber, but from communication, from humanity, from connection. Thank you. To the living and the silent, to the drivers, gunners, loaders, commanders, mechanics, families, your service echoes. We hear you, and we will carry your voice.